There comes a point where a person stops seeing disappointment as bad luck and starts seeing it as a pattern. That realization changes you. Not overnight, not dramatically, not with some big speech or emotional breakdown. It happens slowly. You just start noticing things you ignored before. The way people suddenly become extra kind when they need something. The way some people disappear the moment you stop helping them. The way certain conversations feel less like connection and more like quiet transactions. And after enough years of seeing it happen, you start wondering if people ever truly cared about you at all, or if they only cared about access. I think a lot of highly perceptive people go through this eventually. Not because they hate people, but because they finally stop romanticizing human nature. For most of my life, I tried to see the good in people, even when I noticed inconsistencies, even when my intuition told me something was off, even when the energy shifted right in front of me. I still gave people the benefit of the doubt. And honestly, that mindset cost me a lot. One of the biggest turning points for me happened several years ago. I met someone I genuinely believed could become my future. We connected fast. Too fast, honestly. At the time, it felt exciting. Like one of those rare connections where someone immediately understands you. She seemed deeply interested in me. Almost unusually interested. Now I realize that should have been my first warning sign. Because real connection usually builds slowly. But when someone overwhelms you with attention immediately, sometimes it's not intimacy. Sometimes it's strategy. At first, everything felt intense. Constant attention. Constant affection. Constant reassurance. And when you've spent a lot of your life wanting something genuine, that kind of attention can feel powerful, especially when you're someone who naturally gives people your full heart. She had 2 kids, and I was willing to accept that responsibility. I was mentally preparing myself for a real future. But even early on, something inside me felt unsettled. Not enough to walk away, just enough to quietly notice. Little inconsistencies. Moments where the energy suddenly changed. Moments where I started feeling less appreciated and more tolerated. That shift is hard to explain unless you've experienced it. It's like somebody slowly pulling away emotionally, while still keeping you close enough to benefit from your presence. And perceptive people notice these changes early. That's the frustrating part. People assume perceptive individuals are naive, but most of the time, we notice far more than people think. We just struggle to accept what we're seeing, because accepting it means grieving the version of the relationship we hoped was real. So instead, we rationalize. We explain away red flags. We tell ourselves, they're just stressed. They're overwhelmed. They've been hurt before. We become emotional translators for people who would never do the same for us. And eventually, you start abandoning your own instincts in order to preserve the connection. That relationship only lasted a few months. But honestly, the shortness of it wasn't what hurt. What hurt was realizing how quickly someone can emotionally reposition you once they no longer see value in you. One day, things felt relatively normal. The next, it was over. Cold. Abrupt. Emotionally disconnected. And to this day, I still don't fully know what was real. Maybe there was someone else. Maybe I was just a temporary emotional placeholder. Maybe she already knew it was ending long before I did. I don't know. But what I do know is that deep down, I saw the warning signs much earlier than I admitted to myself. That's something highly perceptive people struggle with. Not blindness, self-betrayal. We ignore our own intuition because we desperately want reality to be softer than it actually is. And honestly, that pattern didn't just exist in relationships. I started noticing it in family dynamics too. That realization was harder, because most people grow up believing family automatically equals loyalty. But life teaches you that blood and genuine care are not always the same thing. Sometimes people learn your personality before they learn your value. They figure out you're dependable, understanding, forgiving. And once people realize you have a hard time saying no, some of them quietly build a relationship around that. I started noticing certain patterns over the years. The extra warmth before a favor, the overly familiar tone before somebody needed money, help, support, or access. Hey, big bro. Hey, cuz. And what hurt wasn't even the request itself. It was realizing the emotional setup behind it. Because when you're perceptive, you can feel intention underneath words. You can hear when somebody suddenly sounds different. You can feel when affection becomes strategic. And after a while, those interactions stop feeling genuine. They start feeling rehearsed, like people are trying to maintain emotional access to you because they know you'll eventually help. That realization changes something inside you. Not because you become cruel, but because you finally notice how one-sided some relationships really were. And one of the strangest things about being highly perceptive is how often people reveal themselves to you. I've had people tell me things I honestly believe they've never told anyone else. Deep fears, dark secrets, painful truths, things most people would only tell a therapist. And for a long time, I thought that meant closeness. Now I think it often means something else. Some people can sense when someone is emotionally safe. They feel understood around you. And while that can create meaningful connection, it can also attract emotionally dependent people who unload their entire internal world onto you without ever asking whether you're carrying too much already. That becomes exhausting over time because highly perceptive people often become emotional containers for everyone else. Everybody vents to them. Everybody leans on them. Everybody seeks comfort from them. But very few people stop and ask, who carries you? And eventually, that imbalance catches up to you. You start feeling emotionally alone even when surrounded by people. Not because nobody exists around you, but because very few people truly see you beyond what you provide. That realization becomes even heavier when it involves people you deeply love. One of the hardest emotional experiences of my life involved my relationship with my son. And I want to speak carefully about this, because life is complicated. People are complicated. Distance changes things. Circumstances shape people in ways we don't fully understand until much later. There was a period in my life where I couldn't physically be there the way I wanted to. An ocean separated us. So I tried to compensate the only ways I knew how. Phone calls, yearly trips, support, time, effort. I genuinely tried to stay connected despite the distance. And when you care deeply about someone, you hold on to hope that those efforts matter more than they probably do. But relationships formed across distance can become emotionally fragile. Not fake, not meaningless, just fragile. And when communication eventually stopped, it hit me harder than I can explain. Because suddenly all those years of trying to bridge that gap emotionally felt incredibly heavy. Not worthless, just painful. And experiences like that force you into deep reflection. You start questioning everything: your judgment, your boundaries, your role in people's lives. You start asking yourself, did people actually value me? Or did they mostly value what I provided emotionally? That question changes a person. I think one of the loneliest experiences in life is realizing you can read people clearly while still wanting to believe the best about them. That creates constant internal conflict because your intuition notices things immediately, but your heart keeps trying to soften the truth. And over time, that emotional contradiction becomes exhausting. You start noticing inconsistencies everywhere. The mismatch between words and energy, the fake enthusiasm, the selective effort, the way some people only reach out when they need emotional support, money, reassurance, validation, or attention. And once you start seeing those patterns consistently, being around certain people becomes draining. Not because you think you're better than them, but because your nervous system gets tired of pretending you don't notice what's happening. I think that's why a lot of perceptive people slowly isolate themselves. Not because they hate connection, but because shallow connection becomes emotionally exhausting once you can see through it. And eventually, you stop craving large groups of people. You stop craving constant social energy. You start craving sincerity, calmness, honesty, consistency. You stop wanting intensity. You start wanting peace. That shift changes your standards completely. You become slower to trust, slower to attach, slower to emotionally invest. And some people will call that bitterness. But honestly, sometimes it's wisdom earned painfully. Because after enough disappointment, your soul starts protecting itself automatically. And one of the biggest lessons I've learned is this: you cannot expect everybody to love the way you love. That sounds obvious. But emotionally, a lot of people spend years believing others naturally think the same way they do. If you would never intentionally use someone, you assume others wouldn't either. If loyalty matters deeply to you, you assume it matters equally to others. If emotional connection feels sacred to you, you assume others view it the same way. But people operate from completely different emotional frameworks. Some people bond through loyalty, some through convenience, some through survival, some through emotional need. And once you understand that, you stop taking everything so personally. You stop expecting yourself to heal everybody. You stop feeling guilty for having boundaries. That's another thing highly perceptive people struggle with. Boundaries feel cruel at first, especially if you naturally empathize with pain. Because when someone gives you a sad story, part of you immediately understands them emotionally. And manipulators often recognize that quickly. They know empathy responds to suffering. So they lead with suffering, not always consciously, not always maliciously, but enough to keep you emotionally engaged. And if you're not careful, you slowly become responsible for people who never planned on becoming responsible for themselves. That realization hurts, especially when you look back and realize how much energy you gave away trying to save connections that were never balanced to begin with. But growth changes things. Eventually, you stop trying to rescue every relationship. You stop chasing explanations. You stop overextending yourself to prove your value. And instead, you start observing, quietly, calmly. You let people reveal themselves through consistency instead of promises. That changes everything, because words can be performed. Character usually can't. I don't think becoming more guarded means you've become cold. I think sometimes it means you finally understand the cost of giving people unlimited access to your heart. And one of the strangest moments in this entire journey was realizing how many relationships quietly disappeared once I stopped overgiving. The calls slowed down, the texts slowed down. Certain people stopped reaching out altogether. At first, that realization hurts deeply, because part of you thinks, if they cared about me, why did the connection disappear so easily? But eventually, another realization replaces it. Some relationships survive your boundaries. Others only survived your lack of them. That distinction changes your entire life. Because once you stop trying to earn connection through usefulness, you finally start seeing who genuinely values your presence. And honestly, that clarity is painful, but freeing. I think a lot of highly perceptive people spend years carrying emotional weight they were never supposed to carry, trying to fix, trying to understand, trying to help, trying to hold relationships together through sheer emotional effort. But eventually, you get tired. Not angry, not hateful, just tired. And maybe that exhaustion is what finally teaches you balance. Maybe that's where healing actually begins. Not in becoming harder, but in becoming more selective, more intentional, more protective of your peace. Because real connection should not constantly feel emotionally confusing. Real connection should not require you to ignore your instincts. Real connection should not leave you questioning your worth every week. And maybe one of the hardest truths in life: is realizing some people only had access to certain versions of you. The endlessly available version. The endlessly forgiving version. The version that kept giving chances. But people don't always adjust well when that version disappears. And honestly, that's okay. Because growth sometimes disappoints the people who benefited most from your lack of boundaries. At 43 years old, I don't think I've become cynical. I think I've just become more awake. I still believe good people exist. I still believe meaningful connection exists. I still believe loyalty exists. But now, I understand those things are rare. And rarity means you stop handing your trust out automatically. You stop forcing closeness. You stop ignoring your own intuition just to avoid being alone. And maybe the biggest lesson in all of this is understanding that being highly empathetic without boundaries can slowly destroy you emotionally. Not because kindness is weakness, but because kindness without discernment becomes self-abandonment. So now, I pay attention to consistency. I pay attention to effort. I pay attention to whether somebody only appears when they need something. And most importantly, I no longer ignore the quiet feeling inside me when something feels wrong, because every single time I betrayed my own intuition, I paid for it later. And maybe that's what this entire journey was really teaching me all along. Not how to stop caring, but how to care without losing myself in the process.